Troughton is almost as important of a doctor in the long-term history of the series as Hartnell, because if he hadn't gotten it right, if he hadn't been accepted by the public, Doctor Who would have ended right then and there. They would have done a few more. They would have done a couple of stories with him and kind of went, you know what? People aren't interested. People aren't watching. Let's just wrap this up. But they didn't. And that's the importance, I think, of Hartnell, the Hartnell-Troughton transition, is the fact that they did it. The fact that, A, they did it at all to begin with instead of just wrapping the show up. But B, the fact that they did it so well, and that Troughton was able to come in and basically go, I'm going to make the Doctor my own.
So what would you say are some of the highlights from the second Doctor's run?
The sad thing, really, in asking about highlights is the fact that the BBC, until the late 1970s, didn't have kind of an established archive policy. And one of the tragic things about that is that, I was talking about the Pertwee stories that the color copies were wiped. For a lot of things before that, the BBC just wiped it, or they made film copies and sold them overseas for a bit and decided they didn't want to keep them, and they literally threw them away. They threw them in a dumpster, basically, and they're sitting in a landfill somewhere even today. And Patrick Troughton's era is particularly affected by that. As recently as 2013, we had, more than half of Patrick Troughton's era did not exist. You simply couldn't sit down and watch it. That's changed over the decades, where fans have been hunting down episodes, and most recently, 2013, we had Enemy of the World and most of Web of Fear turn up. So we have the opportunity to sample Troughton's Doctor and find out who his character was. The sad thing is that most of it doesn't exist. Patrick Troughton's first season as the Doctor doesn't have a complete story from it. There's 2 stories where we have 2 out of 4 episodes. There's, individual episodes from a couple of more, but that's it. The first complete story we have from Patrick Troughton is actually the opening story from his second season in the role, which is Tomb of the Cybermen, which is just a genuine classic of kind of 60s Doctor Who. It's basically a mummy story. Archaeologists go to a mummy's tomb and open it up, that kind of story. And it turns out that there's nefarious things going on inside and people aren't quite what they seem. It's Doctor Who doing a mummy story, and it's just genuinely enjoyable for that reason. Later on in that season, as I said, we have Enemy of the World, which is basically going back to James Bond. It's Doctor Who doing 60s spy-fi. It's actually set, I think, if I'm remembering right, it's set in 2018. So one of the things that's fun is to sit down and watch it and just go, wow, they got things wrong. But it's 6 episodes, but it's so wonderfully sort of directed, and it's so well written as a thriller that you can sit down and kind of engage with it anyways. Web of Fear is another great story from that era. It's the one that introduces the Brigadier. It's set in the London Underground with the Great Intelligence and the Yeti. It's basically a base under siege story, which is the Hartnell era, sort of the Troughton era, I should say, is very big on doing. Really, as a cost-saving measure, they figured out that, hey, we can build 3 or 4 sets and, 3, 4, 5 monster costumes, and we can do a whole story around that. And it's, relatively affordable. So there's that. The War Games is the big sort of climactic story of the Troughton era. It's the one that introduces the Time Lords, because it took 6 years into the show's run before somebody finally went, hey, we should probably give the Doctor a real backstory at this point. And it's just a big epic story of this alien race who's bent on conquering the universe. And who do they turn to learn how's the best way to doing that is the human race. So they pull human soldiers out of the Civil War, the American Civil War, and World War I, and Roman times, and basically put them all together and discover what it is that makes humans, this great warrior species. And then the Doctor shows up into the middle of it and messes up their plans by calling in the Time Lords. But those are, I think, some of the highlights from that. Unfortunately, as I said, most of the era doesn't exist visually anymore. Thankfully, though, from day one, fans were recording things on audio. They were recording the stuff straight off the TV onto cassette tape. So we have everything from Troughton's era on audio, and there's some great stories that exist on audio, but also animation, where they've been able to go in and use those soundtracks and the scripts to kind of come up with what these stories would have looked like. Power of the Daleks, which I mentioned at the beginning of the episode talking about my experiences in Doctor Who fandom, is one of the stories that's been animated. There's an animation of the Macra Terror that's coming out here in the U.S. Later this year that's already come out in the U.K. to great reviews. So those are, I think, some of the highlights of the Troughton era. It's a very sort of, once again, it's a diverse era because Troughton's first season is very much kind of a holdover from the Hartnell era where they're figuring out kind of what to do. The second season is basically a series of base under siege stories. So you end up with, as I said, a small group of characters in 3 or 4 sets dealing with monsters. And that season's important because it introduces the Ice Warriors, the Great Intelligence, and the Yeti. The Cybermen really come into their own that season. So it's a really important kind of for the lore of the show. And then the last season, they kind of were trying to figure out what to do next. And that leads us in a way into John Pertwee's into John Pertwee's era, because they figured out that they couldn't keep, realistically, they couldn't keep doing alien planets in a small studio on no budget, basically. And they came up with a solution to that problem, which, as I said, leads us into what they did with the John Pertwee era.
Thanks for listening. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and join our Facebook group. Live long, and may the Force be with you. Nanu Nanu.